Hey folks, and welcome to the second and final mini lecture for week 8. In last week's mini lecture on immigration, I introduced an interconnected set of structural issues in the US industrial economy around the turn of the 20th century. Those two issues were overproduction and underconsumption, leading to surpluses of manufactured goods and a limited domestic market. The basic economic idea of supply and demand is supposed to influence or regulate or dictate prices. And under a capitalist system, that means that if there is an excessive supply and low demand, prices should fall to increase demand. However, when prices fall, so do profits and wages. And that correlates with lower investment in the overall economy. If a manufactured, teapot costs $1 to make due to wages, materials, and the cost of the factory, but oversupply in the market has pushed the prevailing teapot price to $1.10, then there is little profit, which limits reinvestment. So we are now faced with the issue that industry is too good, too efficient, and too productive, and that prices are falling due to this oversupply. Consumer demand in the US could not absorb its manufacturing output, especially as oversupply put a downward pressure on the wages, decreasing worker purchasing power. As workers purchased fewer manufactured goods due to their lower purchasing power, the oversupply issues became more extreme, and it became a cumulative and circular process. The remedy for this issue was the open door policy, or the US government's explicit foreign policy of securing foreign markets for American commercial exports. American industry desperately wanted to be able to export goods to the markets of Asia, especially China, with its millions of potential consumers. This policy effectively represents the ties between American industry and the American foreign policy establishment, but also emphasizes the expansionism inherent in the American empire. But what is an empire? How does the US qualify as an empire? What is unique about the American empire before World War I in the age of empires? A generic definition of empire is the control of subordinate states or colonies by a dominant or hegemonic state. However, it's a complicated subject and one of much debate among historians. There are some further definitional criteria we consider. These include military expansion and conquest, a potential authoritarian apparatus at home, the use of colonial elites to rule colonies, the creation of states and bureaucracies but not societies, the existence of a frontier that marks insiders from outsiders, hierarchy and stratification that permeate every aspect of society in both the core and the periphery, foundational and persistent violence, and the eventual decline and fall. As far as qualifications of the United States towards the status of empire, let's go through a few points of its resume for the position of empire. Military expansion and conquest. As we saw in Elliot West's Reconstructing Race and our other materials so far, the US has used its military to rein in a rebellious region, namely the American South, to conquer and annex land from Mexico in the West, to suppress resistance against U.S. settler colonialism by Native American groups. However, the US military had also operated abroad in what conservative commentator Max Boot has called small wars, often for the explicit purpose of commercial access. For example, did you know that in 1871, the US landed over 650 troops on the Korean Peninsula during negotiations to open Korea to American goods? And over the course of several skirmishes, US forces killed approximately 200 Korean troops and destroyed several forts. This is just one of many examples, which culminated in the invasion and colonization of the Philippines beginning in 1898, and in the US's participation in the brutal campaign of the Eight Nations Alliance in suppressing the Boxer Uprising in China in 1900. Potential authoritarianism at home. We've seen over the past few weeks the use of private security forces, the National Guard, and the regular army to suppress labor unrest in Idaho, Colorado, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. Of course, for non-white people in the United States, the entire system was authoritarian, whether it was Jim Crow in the South or the reservation and the boarding school system for Native Americans. Another aspect of empire is colonialism and the use of colonial elites to aid in governing and bureaucracy. We can see this in the attempts to form a constabulary in the Philippines, or Native Americans working as police forces on the reservations. But we can also see it in the bureaucracies implanted in colonies. Let's take two presidents of the United States, for example. Before he became president, William Howard Taft was the U.S. government's governor of the Philippines. Before he became president, Herbert Hoover was an American mining engineer who operated in Australia, China, and South Africa and other places as part of the American colonial elite. Another qualification that the U.S. does particularly well is the establishment of a frontier that sets insiders apart from outsiders or others. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented his work, The Significance of the Frontier on American History, at a meeting of historians and intellectuals at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He argues that westward expansion defined the American character. The frontier in American history has been debated by historians and ensconced in American memory and popular culture. But as the U.S. secured territorial control over its chunk of North America, the frontier shifted to the colonies, and their effects, including reservations in urban areas, persist. There's also the hierarchy and stratification in society in an empire. Class, gender, and racial anxieties pervaded the United States. As we saw, Greater Reconstruction only exacerbated racial tensions, and so did American imperialism. As we'll see in the documentary Savage Acts, there was a major question on whether or not to integrate Filipinos into the American body politic, whether they were racially suited to be citizens, and with the U.S. quickly settling on a hard no and the imposition of American rule over the Philippines, rather than any sort of parity, equality, or political participation. There's also foundational and persistent violence in an empire. We've seen the violence of settler colonialism and industrialism across America, and that violence persisted. It was not simply conquest, it was also continuous domination. In 1890, a naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan published an influential book called The Influence of Sea Power on History, 1660 to 1783. He argued that sea power, whether in naval or merchant marine ships, held one of the keys to understanding the rise and fall of empire. Given his argument that naval strength equaled national strength, Mahan was effectively arguing for a massive naval expansion and the acquisition of island colonies to aid in American international commerce, the open door policy. At the time of Mahan's writing, steamships were the cutting edge of naval technology and architecture. Shipbuilders put coal-fired engines into their hulls and attached the drive shaft to a propeller. No longer was shipping dependent on winds and waves, tides and currents. Coal allowed a ship to sail anywhere that was navigable and make a consistent speed. However, this required an expansion of American presence beyond the shores of the United States. A lot of Mahan's theories involved the control of maritime choke points, canals, coaling stations, straits, that sort of thing. Effectively, if the U.S. wanted a commercial empire to enable its industries to export their surpluses, then the U.S. needed to secure coaling stations and ports around the world, whether through negotiation or invasion. So, if the U.S. was going to commit to commercial expansion to preserve its manufacturing sector from its own overproduction trap, then it needed a few things. A merchant marine to carry all the cool stuff to other markets. A navy to protect its shipping and commercial interests. And coaling stations and ports to refuel these ships, and the money to pay for it all. The influence of sea power in history made a major splash among the American elite, and a major buildup of American naval power followed, with shipbuilders producing larger metal, coal-powered ships. In 1898, the United States became increasingly concerned with a simmering insurrection on Cuba against Spain. American commercial sugar interests worried about their investment if Spain cracked down, and the U.S. government dispatched the USS Maine and other ships and forces to the coast of Cuba, ostensibly to protect American interests, but also as a threat. The USS Maine blew up, and most everybody on board died. The probable cause of the explosion was a fault in the coal-powered boiler, a relatively common occurrence at the time. But American politicians and pro-war newspapers used the explosion of the Maine as casus belli for war. President William McKinley got a congressional declaration of war against Spain. Within days of the declaration of war, the U.S. Navy seized a major port after decisively defeating the Spanish fleet. But thousands of miles away in another ocean, in Manila Bay in the Philippines, the U.S. seized the Philippines as a colony and began a brutal 15-year pacification campaign to maintain control. Empires also require a justificational ideology and the means of broadcasting this ideology to its citizens and subjects. One of the major ways to project the American ideology at the turn of the century were World's Fairs. These were massive events, multi-month-long cities that came into being and codified with messages of race, nationalism, gender hierarchy, but especially the United States' ascendance to empire. One of Montana State's historians and a mentor of mine, Bob Rydell, is an expert on World's Fairs. He argues that, quote, fairs provided manufacturers and commercial interests to promote the mass consumption of their products. World's Fairs also attempted to establish a consensus about national priorities, visions of progress, militarism, white supremacy and racial dominance, and economic growth, acting all the while as a presentation of American cultural hegemony and symbolic universes of nationalist ideology, providing a structure of legitimation that constructed a meaningful social experience. The documentary Savage Acts shows a few fairs of the era, especially 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. And they offer some of the most blatant examples of imperial ideology projection. Each fair had huge buildings, often called palaces, that displayed and highlighted the contributions of a particular industrial sector to modern industrial civilization by displaying its products and manufacturers. In the background of this slide, you can see the palaces of electricity and machinery at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Along with the ideologies of race, empire, and nationalism on display at World's Fairs, examples of American industrial production were on display, part and parcel of the American empire. That's it for this week's mini lectures. I'm looking forward to reading your papers, and I'll see you in the Week 9 discussion forums, so you get a little break from me for a little while.